and flow would impact on global and geopolitical dynamics between powers. More recently, I think we have to add a third corner to that triangle, right? Geotechnology, right? Can we really understand global change? Can we really understand competition between powers if we don't understand the technological dimension, right? Three corners of a triangle. So I ask you this, you're all managers of companies. How well versed are you, not just in the economics, and even that is obviously hotly debated, right? How well you know growth markets and opportunities and their risks. How well do you know the geopolitics? Do you just leave it to someone else, right? Or do you just sort of wait until there's a crisis and react to it? How well do you know technology? How well do you understand how new emerging technologies, how disruptive technologies are going to reshape the business landscape? Because a good leader today, whether it's a political leader or a business leader, has to actually be well-rounded in all three of these areas, or certainly have a team that is fluent in these languages. These are languages, right? Politics, economics, and technology are languages. I know almost no leaders in the world, can barely think of one who speaks these languages fluently, right? And it is incumbent on you, if you want to succeed, to understand all three. Just like you need to understand the three layers of geography, the functional, the political, and the natural. You have to understand these three languages to be a successful leader today. That is a challenge. Maybe in the Q&A, someone will ask who I think actually speaks those languages fluently. It's, again, embarrassingly small number, I would say. So it's not just the balance of power, which is, again, a term you see so much in the news today because you hear about US-China rivalry and so forth. How do you get, the balance of power is an output. The input is the technology and innovation, right? And the economic shifts that enable it. So it's the balance of innovation that drives the balance of power. And every empire in history is an example of this. You know, the United States rose through industrial policy, right? Ever see the play Hamilton, or you've heard of Alexander Hamilton, right? Industrial policy, infant industry protection. This is how great powers rise. That's how they amass trade surpluses, build their currency reserves. Then they invest in innovation, modernization, infrastructure. Then they have the capacity to build their militaries and become more expansionist. It starts with technology and with economic policy. The military stuff is the icing on the cake, right? China, no different. People treat China like it's unique in human history, and it's actually not in so many ways, other than its size, right? Following the exact same playbook, and that's what I want to talk about, the strategic industrial policy to capture global value chains. It's happening, I'm going to just jump ahead one and then come back. It's happening in really every sphere. I want to talk about the trade war right now, which we call, some people say, a new Cold War, right? Again, that's people who think they know geopolitics, pretending ignoring economics. Because as I recall in the Cold War, and I don't remember much of it, but I did study it, so I know for a fact that the United States and Soviet Union did not trade all that much with each other. Would anyone care to dispute that? The United States? Okay, right. I think we know that this is not a new Cold War, because obviously the United States and China have a very different kind of economic relationship, right? So only if you know nothing about economics and don't think it matters, would you use a phrase like New Cold War. And like you, I seem to be reading that phrase every day, right? Aren't you? Well, don't read those articles, right? Because those people are missing a couple of corners of the triangle here. They're also obviously, well, now they're waking up to the technology part though, right? People are realizing that, well, this trade war between the United States and China is very much a response to China's Made in China 2025, right? Which is, of course, something that began well before Trump decided to initiate tariffs against China. It's been going on for long enough that it's too late to stop it, right? In fact, as far as the Trump administration should be concerned, it more or less is 2025 already, right? Because there's very little that China cannot acquire from other trade partners on items that it solely depends on the United States for, exceedingly few. And the way to really project this and understand this is first of all, conceptually to understand that it's not war, but tug of war, right? You're connected to your adversary, but you're pulling to get a larger share of the rope, a larger share of the value added in that relationship, right? The sort of supply chains that bind you, it's more like tug of war than war. It's not a military confrontation as yet. And then to understand what the dynamics of that war are. And with this map, which would take a very long time to explain, I'll just give you the sort of headline. This is the Complexity Outlook Atlas. It's produced by MIT and the Harvard Kennedy School. It ranks countries by the extent to which they would improve in the in the complexity ranking of their economy, the value added that they can indigenously produce in their economy by way of intensified imports of high-tech goods, right, from their largest trading partners. So China and India rank very high on this index, and they have for some time, and they've been massively importing foreign technology through their industrial policy for exactly 40 years, more or less, right? And so this is how they have been attempting to, in a way, move up the value chain and in a way displace the countries that have been so critical to their rise as investors. Now, primary among those countries are actually Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, right? Countries that have actually been leading and steadily, consistently investing in China for decades. The United States now adds itself to that list. Germany is on that list. The economies, though, in the world that are the most difficult to substitute, in other words, the quality of their goods, the non-substitutability of their goods, rank the highest are Switzerland, congratulations, Germany, Finland, Japan, South Korea, and a couple of others. So in other words, these countries make everything from the ball bearings for machine tools to the chemical dyes to the industrial robotics to all sorts of goods and services that China has yet to, semiconductors, has yet to fully be able to endogenize, right? And that's what China is going after, right? It's looking at the countries that are at the top of that index and hoping to acquire as much technology as it can from them. And it's been doing this, obviously, for a good long time, right? And countries have been alert to this. This is why there have been, way before Trump was elected, there have been suits brought to the WTO against China on everything from IP theft and so forth. What's interesting is that now other countries, as much as the spotlight is on China, whether you are a command and control sort of authoritarian political economy like China, or you're a democratic market-based economy like India, countries have realized that the fastest way up the value chain is to duplicate this process, right, as much as possible. And hence in India you have Make in India, right? You want to sell pharmaceuticals in India, do your clinical trials there. You want to sell aircraft to India, joint manufacture, right? Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, went to India hoping to open up Apple retail stores. What did Prime Minister Modi say? Sorry, you need to procure 30% of your components from Indian suppliers, right? Of which there are none in terms of the quality of Indian technology goods to feed into the Apple supply chain. So they walked away with no deal. But that's playing hardball. That's industrial policy. And you can fully expect, with the knowledge flows that exist in the world today, with everyone looking at China and its extraordinary pace of development, that they will want to copy those aspects of the Chinese development model that they can, whether it's infrastructure-led growth or whether it is this kind of strategic industrial policy. So that is the new reality of the world economy. Really, every country has become a mixed capitalist state, you could almost say. Now, I mentioned Germany earlier. As you well know, China has made enormous investments into Germany, seeking to acquire robotics companies, other high-tech goods, and so forth. And then after 2016, with the Medea acquisition of KUKA robotics company, that's when when light really went off, and Germany has become much more sort of scrutinizing deals much more closely, as again all Europeans are. So one area where you see transatlantic convergence is on this issue of how to try to limit, how to restrict Chinese access to advanced technologies without reciprocal opening of market access. So now let me talk about that. Because one of the things that the Trump administration has misunderstood in this trade war is the notion that it could unilaterally, in a way, dictate how China, in a way, sort of deals with tariffs, right? It's believed that the Trump administration believes that the tariffs are going to hurt China more than America, and so on and so forth. This is the map that they sort of, failed to look at. Right. North America as a whole accounts for only 14% of global trade, which means it's really the most autarkic, major economic region of the world, right? The most self-sufficient, if you will. And if you think about North America, it has energy self-sufficiency, more or less. It has a lot of people. It has talent, labor pool. It has technology, food, water, just about everything, right? So for North America, the United States, for example, its trade to GDP ratio is, I think, less than 10%, right? It's quite a bit less. So far less than other major economies, right? And what they missed is the Europe here, sitting in the middle, right? I mean, in a way, many people who are writing about the U.S.-China trade war as if the fate of the world economy hangs in the balance just failed to notice the very, very simple data, this very, big circles on this map. Europe, owing, of course, to a large degree to its internal trade, accounts for 38% of global trade. But here's the important part. Look at the trans-Eurasian relationship. Look at the Europe-Asia axis, right? $1.6 trillion is what it says. What is the volume of transatlantic trade? Which, again, for all of us growing up in whether it's the 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s, that was the real anchor of the world economy, was the transatlantic free trade area, right? Two largest economic zones in the world, representing, particularly the G7 economies straight through the 80s, represented 80% of global GDP and output, right? Whereas today, you can see that Europe already today, this is not a forecast, this is not a scenario, this is not a projection, this is today. Europe trades substantially more with Asia than the United States does. And Europe trades a lot more with Asia than it even does with the United States, right? This is the reality of today. So for just about everything that Trump seeks China to have to pay more for from the United States or to prohibit from getting it all, China's just going to get it from one of its other larger trading partners. Now, China's largest trading partners are its neighboring Asians. So for China, number one is not America in terms of trade. For China, number one is just its neighbors in Asia, right? We've had 20 plus years of economic, particularly trade integration occurring in fits and starts. Not high standard trade agreements, but still incremental liberalization in Asia, right? And that's really goes through, certainly with the beginning, even if you began at the Asian financial crisis, that's really when things really took off. By 2004, 2005 is when intra-Asian trade began to exceed trade between Asia and other parts of the world. And that's why when a few years later the financial crisis happened, it didn't really feel like a global financial crisis for those in Asia, right? They were substantially cushioned from the shocks. And I remember plenty of people going on television saying this is going to be a disaster for Asia. They're dependent entirely on exports to developing markets. There's a simple line you can draw of Asia's dependence on exports to developing markets versus its trade amongst emerging markets, particularly within Asia. And those lines crossed in 2004, right? So fast forward to today, and you have Asia representing 34% of global trade and growing very, very rapidly. So now, for China, again, number one set of trading partners is fellow Asians, number two is Europe, and number three is the United States. So from China, so if you're sitting in Beijing, your number three most important trading partner has just launched a war against you, thinking that it can cut you off from all supplies. Now let's link that to the previous point about technology. 70% of Chinese high-tech imports come from Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Europe, right? Particularly Germany, right? So today, whenever Trump, for example, if you take the ZTE issue, right? When Trump initiates export controls on sensitive technology goods and their exports to Chinese companies, of course, it disrupts their supply chains. It can have a terrible impact on their market position for a while. But they can easily substitute those goods with those from any of these other countries. And if you don't think that the Koreans and the Japanese and the Germans are calling up these Chinese companies every day saying, hey, Trump just cut you off from buying, Qualcomm or Intel chips, just get them from us, you'd be joking. No one sits on the sidelines. Trade wars like this have way more than two players, right? This trade war has at least four, right? And I can name you two winners at least from this trade war. One is Europe. The other is the rest of Asia, who are piling in to substitute for America. Look at soybeans, look at oil and gas, look at chips, semiconductors, you name it. And of course, for China, this is great, because those countries are actually more dependent on China, and they're less likely to represent a political risk of a sort of supply cutoff than they are, right? And this is also great for South Korea and Japan that actually have surpluses with China, right, and want to expand them. And that's why just last month the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and China got together saying we need to actually liberalize our trade further. So everyone wants to substitute for the US. They're not waiting on the sidelines. So I think that's the way this is going to play out. Part of it is, of course, the appeal of the Asian market, right? I'll get into sort of the Silk Road dimension in a second. But I mean, just sort of reflect on this for a minute, because there's something significant about the fact that most of the world population lives within this circle. It's not only, what's significant is not only that it's true today, right, but that it's always going to be true. For those of you who are familiar with some of the demographic forecasts, the world population is not likely to cross 10 billion people. Most of the people who are alive, who are ever going to live in the world, are alive today already. We will hopefully, I pray, all be alive to witness the day when on the front page of the newspaper it says world population reaches its peak and begins to plateau and even decline, because that's projected to happen in the 2040s, right? So that means that literally Asia is going to be the demographic center of the world for the rest of human history, for so long as we survive as a species, right? This is a big deal. It's not a temporary blip, right? This would qualify as a structural change, if you ask me. But what's important is not just the size, because actually Asia has always had the largest populations, right? China and India have always been the two most populous, almost the societies in the world. But what makes an economy significant or region significant is not just its size, but its degree of connectivity, right? And that's embodied in two ways. One is urbanization, right? People moving from rural areas to urban areas, right? Their incomes rise, they join the consumer class, they get connected to global supply chains. And the other is the connectivity between the countries and the cities, right? A regionalizing region, if you will. What Europe has done, of course, already, is something that is happening in a different way, but along a similar trajectory in Asia. So here you can see that actually all of the world's busiest international flight routes are within Asia. Number 11 is New York, Toronto, but I think it's quite a ways behind. Singapore, Jakarta, Singapore, KL, Dubai with some of its Gulf neighbors. Those are the busiest airline routes in the world. The trans-Asian medium haul, if you will, some of those routes that are depicted here are also growing very, very quickly. So that's one part that you might call the sort of aerial Belt and Road. When we talk about Belt and Road, you're more familiar with an image like this. This is in the middle of connectography, this map. And it shows you, my rendition, if you will, of the major transportation and energy corridors that are being built. So to make this map, I consulted with every single government you see here, from Mongolia to Iran to Turkmenistan. Said, what are the railways, what are the pipelines, where are the major special economic zones, what new electricity grids, everything are you building, who's financing it, which neighbors are you cooperating with the most, and so on and so forth. And this is what came out. And you can see that there's a major deficit, right? As you probably know, there's a major deficit of infrastructure, major sort of market failure, if you will. That market failure has been around since the 50s and 60s, since decolonization, when the countries on this map, dozens of them, were born, like India and Pakistan. They've had very little new infrastructure investment in decades. Their populations have tripled, many of them. The population of India has more than tripled. The population of Pakistan has more than tripled since independence. And, of course, these countries were largely cut off from each other because of the Cold War, because of poverty, whatever the case may be, or because their trade relations with their colonial masters were stronger than with their own neighbors. And now, in a way, history is resetting, right? They're rediscovering the ancient Silk Roads. Because, of course, for hundreds, if not for thousands of years, Asian societies did have a lot more trade with each other than with anyone else, right? It was not even until the 16th century, in many cases the 17th century, really, where Europe began to play a dominant role in Asian economies. So you have the return, if you will, of a very normal pattern of history. Now, what's important is that this infrastructure is absolutely necessary, right? I gave you the demographic reason why, the market failure in infrastructure. Now, whether it's Chinese-funded bilateral loans, grants, projects, or whether it's multilateral, whether it's just countries increasing their infrastructural allocations in capex, the way that India is doing, 20% of its budget going to infrastructure, right? That's what all of these countries need to be doing. So often, I'm sure I'm not the first person to quote you the statistic that Asian economies need to spend about $5 trillion on infrastructure in the next 7 to 8 years, by 2025, in order to meet their capacity needs in basic utilities, roads, and sanitation and so forth. Well, that's true. It's got to come from somewhere, right? A lot of it is going to be just shifting fiscal priorities, such as they are. And what does that do? Well, when governments spend, one of the leading indicators of foreign investment is a country simply generating a stable electricity supply. I know that Arturo can validate this point. Extremely important. Rankings of what motivates, what drives foreign investment. Is this country of electricity, right? Well, a lot of these countries don't. They don't. So who's going to invest there? But when you do, it's remarkable how FDI takes off and it remains relatively stable. Quality infrastructure attracts investment, government investment attracts foreign investment, and that's what we see starting to happen here with countries that are becoming sort of investor darlings that weren't even on the investor map earlier. We're seeing poverty go down, we're seeing urbanization rise, we're seeing disposable income grow. There is really a virtuous circle going on. Now I'll make a geopolitical point, which is that a lot of people view Belt and Road as a Chinese hegemonic project, right? Almost sort of a debt trap diplomacy, a very common phrase today. Again, lazy analysis, right? A lot of these countries already had pretty high debt to China before Belt and Road began. Their debt has certainly gone up. Almost all poor countries, most of their debt, have one or two benefactors, so it's no surprise if a Tajikistan or a Mongolia or a Kyrgyzstan has most of the outstanding debt to China, right? It's actually very common for that to be the case. Most importantly, in order to grow, you have to spend, right? I mean, no one's going to invest in your economy. You're not going to diversify. You're not going to have industries and output and exports and growth if you don't spend. And to some degree, that's going to require debt growing. There's good debt and there's bad debt. I would argue that most infrastructure projects tend to be good debt. The media may lead you to point to one, have one sort of, white elephant type of project, but that's not how I would characterize most infrastructure spending that's going on. Now, what happens over time is that if these countries spend wisely, they will grow, they will attract investment, they will actually dilute their dependence on China, right? They can start to play the market. They will start to attract American, European, other investment, and it turns out that Belt and Road won't promote Chinese hegemony, but it'll promote the confidence of these countries that have been backwaters, third world, second world countries, and they will start to play the game, and you're already seeing that happening. We see it in Malaysia, we see it in Myanmar, and Myanmar is a very underdeveloped country, but there's enough interest, enough diplomatic maneuvering going on in Myanmar to convince them that they have the confidence to force China to renegotiate on onerous debt. Pakistan is doing it, and so forth. Now, if this were the neo-colonial age, which again is a phrase you hear all the time, then of course China wouldn't have to negotiate, right? I don't recall the British